Are you a parent navigating the complexities of co-parenting, family court, or even domestic violence? If you are looking for ways to help protect your children and build a strong and supportive community around you, then look no further. Gray Minds Think Alike is your go-to resource for everything related to the complexities of family life. Join us as we dive into thoughtful conversations with experts and explore practical tips and strategies for tackling the challenges of parenthood in the throes of adversity so that no parent feels alone and every child's safety is protected. Welcome back to Gray Minds Think Alike, where we dive deep into the conversations that matter with experts who enlighten, inspire, and empower. Today, we're joined by two extraordinary advocates, Barry Goldstein and Veronica York, whose partnership has helped transform how we understand child safety, domestic violence, and family court reform. Together, they've dedicated their lives to protecting children, empowering survivors, and educating the courts and professionals who hold families' futures in their hands. Barry is a nationally recognized domestic violence expert, author, speaker, and attorney with over 4 decades in experience with law, policy, and reform. Veronica is a certified high-conflict divorce coach, expert witness, and survivor advocate who uses her lived experience and professional expertise to guide parents through some of the most difficult custody battles imaginable. Today, we'll explore their collaboration, their life-saving research behind their new book, Preventing Domestic Violence and Child Abuse, Medical, Law Enforcement, Judicial, and Human Benefits, and how we can play a role in building a safer system for families and children. So thank you so much and welcome to Gray Minds. I really appreciate you speaking with us. I'd love to know how your partnership began and just a little bit about each of you.
Thank you so much for having Barry and I here. We are honored to be on your podcast, and we just resonate so much with stories like yours because this is the work that we do every single day and hear things just like your story every single day. And just for me personally, how I got started in this work is I did have lived experience I was married to an abuser for 10 years, went through family court. He took me back to court for full custody. And in that experience, I learned that the family court system is not set up to help children have safe and healthy lives in child custody cases, particularly when there's domestic violence or child abuse. And because of that experience, I was doing a totally different career and decided that I was going to change careers after I went through that so that I could help other mothers going through the same thing. Became a certified high conflict divorce coach and started coaching in March of 2021, at which time I decided I wanted to look into expert witness work because I felt like that was missing in a lot of the cases I was, not only in my own case, but in the cases that I was working on as a coach, is to have someone to go to court to educate the court about the research that really supports that their standard court practices are harming children. And I don't think they understand that's the case. And so I reached out to Barry Goldstein because his name kept coming across my desk as an expert witness and someone who knew a lot about this topic. And when I spoke with him, everything he said just resonated, and the research behind it and his experience. And not long after our first conversation, he reached out to me and asked if I would like to join him in being an expert witness and learn about how to become an expert witness in these cases to take over his work eventually. Because unfortunately, he wants to retire at some point. No one wants him to. I know I don't, but it's bound to happen. And so I'm just very grateful that he mentored me, took me under his wing, taught me a lot about what's going on, the research behind it. And as we started collaborating, as we started doing expert witness work and writing the book that we wrote, writing articles, doing webinars and podcasts and things like that and educating, it just became abundantly clear that this is so needed. And every group in our movement, I'll call it the DV movement, of legislation to law enforcement to medical professionals to educators, we all have a role to play in preventing this and helping courts do better. So Barry and I are very dedicated to that. And I'm just completely blessed to have met him, to have been able to work with him and continue to work with him And so that's how our partnership started. But I'll let Barry talk a little bit about his perspective as well.
So I grew up a typical sexist guy, not particularly better or worse,
Sure.
than most men in our society. And what happened was I had a case in which my client, who was a father, had hit his daughter. And I didn't know if what he did constituted abuse. And I thought, if I don't know with the legal training, how is a parent in general going to know? And so at about that time, a friend of mine asked me to serve on the board of my sister's place, which is a battered women's shelter in Westchester County, New York. And I
Okay.
thought that if I did that, I would learn and I could help my clients better. And that's exactly what I did. And essentially what happened was there were no other attorneys really working with DV. And so as I learned, I became more involved. The best thing I did on the board was I shut my mouth and I listened to the women. And that's how I learned. And more I got recommendations for people doing DV cases. So it became an ever greater part of my work. And what next happened is a lot of my clients talked about they wanted to write a book about their experiences, and none of them ever did. So I wrote a book to tell their stories and talk about the process of going through the courts to leave their abuser. And that was my first book, Scared to Leave, Afraid to Stay. And
I want to write a book too.
yes, so that put me in the middle of the start of the Protect the Mothers movement. And I got the kind of email that all authors would hope for. Someone wrote me and said, can I buy multiple books? Can I get a discount? And that email came from Dr. Mo Therese Hanna. And it started a collaboration that we've worked together for many decades. And it put me in the middle of the Protective Mothers movement. It was around the time of the start of the Battered Mothers Custody Conference. And I kept going from there.
Right. How do men perceive your role? Do you have male clients? Do they think anything? I'm just curious what men think.
We occasionally take a male client, as domestic violence is a gendered crime in heterosexual relationships. It's overwhelmingly what men do to women, but there are exceptions.
Sure.
And when we get cross-examined, the attorneys for the abusers want to emphasize the exceptions. So it depends on the particular man. We've had men who hired us, and when we looked into it, it turned out they were the abuser. We wrote that in our report, and they had no more interest in us working with them. And we've had a few cases where the man was, in fact, the victim, had been mistreated, and we're trying to help them.
Now, it's very admirable that you're an attorney and you're like, okay, I need to understand what's going on here so I can better help your clients and everyone involved. Why do you think other lawyers don't get on board with that? Why wouldn't they want to do everything they can to do their best job, win, and also help children and families?
The thing that surprises me the most, there are many, many attorneys that will spend tens of hours learning some technical subject so they can do a better job for their client, cross-examining the other side's experts, etc. And domestic violence, where they're having that case over and over again, they don't do it. They don't view domestic violence as a specialized area of knowledge. But what I think has really happened is the custody courts didn't know how to respond to domestic violence at the start. No one did. There was no research, and they developed practices based on false assumptions, like the idea that DV was caused by mental illness or substance abuse. And so all these practices they developed, and it turned out that they were wrong, but they just keep using the same failed practices. And I think attorneys, they're in a movement or a system that keeps getting it wrong. They've heard the wrong things constantly, and they're trying to get along. As a young attorney, they teach you to work with other attorneys to get settlements. They want cases settled, and that's perfectly valid. It doesn't work as well in a DV case because a lot of the settlements would place children in jeopardy.
So, what do you think is going on as of today in family courts?
Think about it for a second. There are two really critical pieces of research that go to the essence of the well-being of children, and that's the ACE study and the Saunders study. Without ACE, courts minimize the harm from domestic violence and child abuse. Without Saunders, they're relying on the wrong professionals and they disbelieve true reports. ACE came out in 1998. Saunders in 2012, the courts still aren't using them.
Can you briefly explain to our listeners what those are?
Sure. The ACE research is peer-reviewed medical research, comes from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention.
Okay.
Fundamentally, what it says is that children exposed to domestic violence, child abuse, other traumas will live shorter lives and face a lifetime of health and social problems. And most of the harm from DV and child abuse is not any immediate physical injury. It's that abusers cause. Peer-reviewed scientific research comes from the National Institute of Justice in the U.S. Justice Department. So we're talking about highly credible research. The purpose of Saunders was to determine the domestic violence knowledge of judges, lawyers, and especially evaluators, because judges and lawyers get most of their information about DV from evaluators. And we could talk about it for hours, but fundamentally what Saunders said is that court professionals do not have the specific domestic violence knowledge that they need, and that best practices would require a multidisciplinary approach, and the courts aren't doing that. The fact is the courts aren't using the two best tools to better protect children, but instead they're strongly influenced by a biased and unscientific alienation theory that has destroyed so many children's lives. And all these years later, that bogus theory, twice rejected by the American Psychiatric Association because there's no research to support it, has more influence over the courts than ACE and Saunders, which courts could use to protect all our children. It doesn't make sense. I have never heard a judge explain why they're not using ACE.
So you don't know, as of right now, you don't know why they use either?
I think a lot of it is inertia. And I think some of it is that they don't want to admit that what they've been doing
is wrong. Right. So how do we get them to acknowledge it and show them really what it is? Is that part of what both of you do?
We're actually working on it in some interesting ways.
Okay.
Hopefully the book will help. But we have been working with a retired judge in California who understands this and supports what we're doing. And we're putting together a proposal for the National Judicial College to start training judges about how to protect children. And our proposal, in addition to coming from Veronica and I, going to include a pediatrician who's worked with ACE and as a child was in one of these DV cases where the court didn't protect her. It includes a psychologist and evaluator, one of the few that actually understands domestic violence, and it includes this judge. So we're hoping that this kind of a multidisciplinary approach they might listen to. And so we're in the process of drafting a proposal, and it's one of the things we're trying to do.
All right. Let's talk about your book then, since it seems to tie everything in together, especially it has some striking comparisons between the ACE studies and the Surgeon General reports on smoking. Can you explain this connection and why it matters?
You might want to start, and Veronica, do you want to talk about what we wrote about ACE? I think your viewers would find that very interesting.
Okay. Yes. So there is a chapter in our book. I wrote 3 chapters in our book, one about CPS and its role in child custody cases. I want one about the father's rights movements. And Barry and I both wrote a chapter about alienation. And one of the things that we talk about often is that there is such thing as alienation, because all abusive fathers alienate the children. They talk disparagingly about the mother, it undermines the relationship. They try to impose harmful things in that child, and the courts...
It's almost a psychological reversal. They say you're alienating, but in doing so, they were alienating.
Right? So we wrote an article basically with a new approach to alienation. And that is that because when courts now use alienation, they only are looking at the behaviors of the mother. It's a very gender biased theory. And it was meant to be that way, right? It was concocted to be that. It was made to give abusive fathers custody and take them away from good mothers who were the primary attachment figure. And so it only looks at the behaviors of the mother. And what we're trying to say is we need to look at the behaviors of both parents when we're considering alienation, if we want to be fair about this. And we want to look at the behaviors to determine if that behavior is causing the damage in the relationship with the father and or with the other parent. So meaning anything at this moment can be looked at as alienation. You can look at a mother's behavior and say she's alienating the child, but they're not looking at the father's behavior. So if we want to be fair, we look at the father's behaviors, and we can probably point out many tactics of the father that show that he's willing to hurt the child in order to hurt the mother. Because again, they're not using custody or seeking custody because they want more time with the child. They're doing it because they want to control the situation and punish the mother for reporting his abuse. So if we look at it that way, it helps us to determine what behaviors really are causing the problem in the relationship. The parent accusing the other parent of alienation typically has no personal knowledge of what goes on in the other parent's home. So everything that they're saying for the most part is speculation. Oh, she's saying this, she's doing this, it's causing this, it's her problem. And sometimes they don't even give an explanation. They say it's her fault, but the child doesn't want to be around me. And then mental health professionals chime in and say, yeah, the mother is imposing her emotions on the child and all of this nonsense. We want the courts to, if they're going to consider alienation, they should absolutely look at the behaviors of both parents to determine if the father is acting in a way that would absolutely cause the resistance of the child to want to go see that father.
Right. So how do they even prove alienation as of
Well,
right now?
as of right now, they're
Yeah.
using the cottage industry of professionals who make a lot of money touting this unscientific theory that basically says anytime a child doesn't want to go with the father, it has to be alienation. And any allegations of abuse are false. That's the assumption with this theory. And so because of that, courts are buying into this myth that mothers frequently make false reports of abuse. And then they're saying because she's making false reports of abuse, she's alienating the child. So that's how they're getting to those really horrible consequences and really horrible outcomes for children when these theories are used and misused, I would say.
Gotcha. And so tell us more about what's in the book. So you have chapters on alienation, and what else can readers expect?
One of the things we found very interesting is that the failure of the courts to protect children, let me say it a different way, the ability of abusive fathers to manipulate the courts to regain power and control has resulted in a huge increase in domestic violence homicide. And the problem is that the courts do not understand the fundamental nature of DV custody cases. They're thinking high conflict, both parents are angry at each other. In almost all of the cases that we see, what happened is a victim of domestic violence sought to escape her abuser, reported his abuse, and he goes after custody, claims the mother is suddenly unfit in retaliation. And so the courts don't understand the nature. And the history here is at the start of the modern domestic violence movement in the 1970s, as a society, we did several reforms to make it easier for victims to get criminal prosecution, restraining orders, divorce, custody, shelter, economic and other support. What all of those things have in common is it made it easier for the victim to escape. As a result, for 3 decades, the DV homicide rate went steadily down. So in 1976, about the start of the DV movement, 1,600 women were murdered by their abusive partners, their intimate partners.
Wow.
By 2005, that number had been reduced to 1,181. So there was this steady and real decline. And for a moment, it seemed like we could really dramatically reduce domestic violence because DV homicide is the best indication of all domestic violence because DV is very much underreported. But with DV homicide, there's a body, she's not lying about him killing her. So if you think about it, we're making all this progress And what would happen with a reduction in domestic violence is that less children would witness domestic violence, and that would in turn reduce domestic violence even more. The problem is that the male supremacist groups didn't like that. They didn't like that what they believed was their right to control their partners was being diminished. And so they developed these really unspeakably cruel tactics to use custody as their means to regain control. And that's where they got the alienation and the equal parenting and the high conflict and friendly parent. They used a variety of tactics, and they used their financial superiority because DV is about control, including financial control. So most of the money is on the side of abusive fathers. That's why the cottage industry developed to take that money, which means they need to help abusive fathers.
Right.
And so that's the problem. So they started these tactics. It's interesting, when I did my Quincy book, Quincy model, which was the best practices for preventing domestic violence, I interviewed Bill Delahunt, the district attorney there. And he said that when an abusive father sought custody, the victim stopped cooperating. That didn't derail the success in Quincy, because at that time it was a rare tactic. Today, it's a standard abuser tactic to go after custody as a way to regain control. And they've done that. And so now it's standard. And so the last statistics we have was from 2016, when 1,690 women were murdered. So all the progress that we made was lost, and it went up above that at a time when all other murders are down. So we know the cause, and we know that some communities that use better practices had even lower rates of DV homicide. No one has talked about this before. This is brand new in the book. We're excited to share it, and it really explains what the courts are doing wrong.
Okay.
So that's one. Veronica, you want to talk about the cancer and heart disease? I usually do that.
Sure. As part of our research in our book, we are working with the American Heart Association and the Cancer Society. As you mentioned earlier, we are linking as we did back in the 1960s when the Surgeon General's report came out and said there is a link between smoking and cancer. And everybody was like shocked, because there had been so many advertisements and things that said it was perfectly fine and healthy and all of these things. And of course, Big Tobacco at that time wanted to shut that down. They used their immense financial resources and immense power that they had at the time to lobby and try to keep this information from getting out.
Sure. They wanted to make money.
Correct. Yeah. But ultimately, there were class action lawsuits that happened, and they ended up losing, and they ended up having to give a whole bunch of money to make public service announcements and things like that to warn the public. And you still see it to this day on cigarette cartons and cigarettes, that this is linked to smoking, is linked to cancer. And all aspects of society kind of came together to help people understand, if you're pregnant, don't smoke. If you don't want lung cancer later in life, don't smoke. It's like a preventive thing that we all came together to try and help it, from the media all the way down to medical professionals and those types of things. And so we're excited because the ACE research we can make that same connection. And as
Okay.
we're working with the American Heart Association, they have the same research that confirms what the ACE research is saying, in that exposure to domestic violence can cause, in children specifically, can cause things like heart disease and cancer later in life because of that stress. You go to the doctor.
Trauma.
Yeah, if you have a heart issue and you go to the doctor, one of the first things they're going to tell you is to reduce your stress, because toxic stress over time can have very body to fatigue, to all kinds of illnesses, and of course, things like cancer and heart disease. And so, in fact, the American Heart Association put out a press release, I think January of this year, stating that children who are exposed to domestic violence, heart disease later in life, and they also said in that study that if a child has a nurturing parent, one nurturing parent, that is a defense or a protective factor for a child that would decrease their chance of getting heart disease later in life. So that really does coincide directly with the ACE research that says if a child is protected, they can avoid those horrible consequences from ACEs. That include things like anxiety, depression, low
Sure.
self-esteem, suicide, and obviously getting diseases and illnesses. And so we really are making that connection in our book with different aspects of society. Again, law enforcement, medical professionals, educators, and mental health professionals that use the ACE research. This is not just something that Barry and I think is important. This is
Sure.
something from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that has been initially used as medical research to diagnose and treat patients. And now, many educators use it with children who have been exposed to trauma. And the one thing they've learned from the ACE research is not to ask what's wrong with this child, but to ask what's been done to this child so that they can better understand how to help trauma in children and helping them not live shorter lives. And so we are excited about that connection.
Well, it's definitely true for all people that suffered any kind of trauma. I have really high blood pressure because I'm constantly stressed. I have depression. I have anxiety. I have all these things that are definitely leading to other conditions and ailments. And it affects your whole body, mind and body. So,
It,
how can you get, I guess, doctors and health professionals on board with understanding the correlation?
It's interesting you asked that. When we were meeting with the Cancer Society, they sent us a research study of all the studies that linked domestic violence with cancer. And one of the conclusions was that pediatricians are in a particularly good position to talk about this because they work with these children all the time. They know how it impacts them. And in our society, doctors like pediatricians receive a lot of respect. People
Sure.
would tend to listen to them.
Right.
So that could be helpful. And I mentioned before, we're working with a pediatrician. Her name is Dr. Corley Okeson. And we actually did some medical trainings for judges to share this information. And coming from someone like her, they're more likely to listen. That's part of what we can do.
Right. Now, let's talk about expert witness. How does it affect hearings and how do you become one?
Yeah, I guess the best answer I can tell you is it depends. Lawyers and judges are not used to DV experts. And so it depends. We've had attorneys that have been wonderful, have been willing to present the information and make a real difference. And we're really excited. There are many children who are alive today because we got through to the court. And then the other side of it is there are judges that don't want to listen. And I know you know that, and sometimes we can't get through, but we try. This information is so compelling because we will calculate the ACE score of the children. And the bottom line from the ACE score is that children who have multiple ACEs, which is all the cases we have, will live shorter lives. If the judge wants to just do the usual things, ignore what we're saying, on average, they're going to cost the children, whether it's several years or 20 years, many years from their life. That's an incredibly compelling thing to say.
Sure.
And we like to say, no judge wants to hurt children. And yet there are judges who do it. And we hope that it'll make a difference. And the best we can say is sometimes it makes a difference.
Right. Well, that's where expert witnesses come in? How do they play their part in the role? Like Veronica, you became an expert witness, right? And you did so because you wanted to show both sides of a case or?
Well, we're there to help the court understand domestic violence. And as an expert in domestic violence, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about domestic violence in family court. One of the most common is that it's physical violence and that's all that matters. And they say just because the father hurt the mother doesn't mean he'll hurt the child. And
What they said in my case.
and we know what happened in your case. And so that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to say hurting the mother is hurting the child. And the ACE research is so important to that message because the ACE research is what confirms what we're saying. And it says it's scientific, it's medical, it's peer reviewed, it's highly credible, comes from the most credible resources. And it's saying to you, judge, that if you don't listen to this, if you don't use ACE in your decision, you are going to harm this child. End of story. This child will live a shorter life and have health problems, anxiety, depression. I don't think that's what you want as an outcome. So we're telling you we need to use ACE in this case to show that best practices are that the safe parent gets custody. They have decisions over health and medical decisions, because Saunders tells us that abusive fathers will use decision making to block anything the mother wants, particularly things like therapy and medical treatment, because they do not want their abuse to be exposed. And the abusive parent, typically the father, needs to have supervised visits until he can change his behavior. We're never going to tell a court, unless there's something drastic, that we don't want this father in this child's life at all. We're saying we want to give the court best practices and a path that the father can potentially have a good relationship with the child, a healthy and safe one. And when I say good, that's what I mean, healthy and safe. Because one of the things that frustrates me so much in family court, and I know that you probably understand this, and as a mother, this was most frustrating to me, is that they think that mothers don't want fathers in children's lives. That can't be farther from the truth.
Sure.
We would want nothing more than our children to have good fathers, healthy fathers, safe fathers, fathers that are going to be there, protect and care for and provide for the children. That's why the fathers' rights movement is, I'll just say, ridiculous. I have a whole chapter of it in our book, but I wrote that chapter because it's very specific to my passion about this movement. And that is that good fathers are needed and wanted. So there's no need for a fathers' rights movement. If you are a good father, then the child will want you in your life. The mother will want you in that child's life. There is going to be no issue.
You're going to do what's best for the child.
Correct. The fathers' rights movement is about abusive fathers wanting to regain control with this. And shared parenting is a whole nother topic, but it's certainly not in the best interest of a child to be forced to spend time, especially unsupervised, with someone who's abusing them emotionally. Forget about the physical. We all know that's bad, but the emotional part is what ACE tells us causes the most harm. So that's where we want to make a difference as experts, to come in and share this research.
And how do you feel it's received by judges?
Well, as Barry said, it depends on the judge.
Right.
I just observed a trial it was in Utah. Yeah, it was Utah recently that Barry did. The judge was phenomenal. She listened to what Barry had to say. She didn't allow opposing counsel to object to everything he was saying. She was really interested in ways of how to save this child. And then there have been judges that don't even want to hear us, that allow us to testify, but then don't really take anything we say into consideration in their decision. And it's the protective parent is the one who hires us, because we're going to come in and support what they already have as a case, as far as what, and all cases are different, obviously, but they're going to hire us to come in and use the research to support the facts and circumstances of their particular case. And I know you asked earlier, how do you become an expert witness? I think there is a misconception also. We were talking about misconceptions in court of who is a domestic violence expert, who determines who domestic violence expert is. And right now in the family courts, they look to mental health professionals as the experts. And that's why the Saunders study is so important, because the Saunders study is telling us they're using the wrong experts. Mental health professionals are not domestic violence experts. They're experts in psychology and mental illness, but with rare exceptions, they are not experts in domestic violence. In fact, they typically ignore, minimize, or don't believe reports of domestic violence. And so, and to make things worse, if that mental health professional is an evaluator and they are also part of the cottage industry of alienation, then not only do they not believe any of the abuse reports, they use it against the mother to claim alienation. And so they're a huge part of the problem in family court. And so we want to educate the court as to who a domestic violence expert is. An expert in domestic violence is someone with lived experience, someone who works full time in domestic violence issues, like advocates, people in the domestic violence shelters and things like that. And they're also people who understand the research. And that's important because as experts, we're the only ones who can talk about the research. If you're not an expert, you can't talk about the research. And so as an expert, you come in and you're able to do that. And we did a series of webinars with domesticshelters.org. And from that series of webinars, we're trying to get into talks with them to create a program to train other advocates to become experts and to be able to testify. So we're hoping we can do something like that in the future to
Yeah.
where we can train others to do this in every state so that this isn't something that is uncommon as it is right now, although we stay busy and we know it's needed and we work in every state. I've been qualified in 10 states so far. Barry's been qualified in over 30 states. And so we know every state needs this and we want to be able to provide that resource to every state. And hopefully sometime in the near future, we can start a program to do
Yeah,
that.
for sure. I hope to get it here in Florida. I know it's something that you just mentioned about how no mother really doesn't want a child to have the father in their life. Like, of course,
Mhm.
they do. And in my case, I wasn't even with Grayson's father. We lived in separate states. I didn't even have to tell him that I was having a baby, having his baby. I could have just gone on my merry way, had Grayson, and lived the life that I always wanted to live. So if I really didn't want him in his life, I could have gone that route.
Exactly. And that's exactly the point. And
And
it's
that's my
very
biggest regret.
frustrating. Yes. And I hear that. And absolutely it would be a regret. The courts wonder why, like in states like Kentucky, which in my opinion is one of the worst states in the country. And the reason for that is because it was the first state to implement the presumption of 50-50.
Right.
And
Sure.
that 50-50 presumption is what is so harmful
Yep.
because
We have
protective,
it now in Florida.
protective mothers have no chance. And when there are statistics coming out in Kentucky right now, and fathers' rights groups are so excited because it's saying that divorce rates are down in Kentucky and they're contributing it to this 50-50 legislation. What they're not realizing is that homicide rates are going up. And the reason for that is because mothers are now not going to leave knowing that they're going to have their child go to the abuser 50% of the time, unprotected, unsupervised. And so homicide rates are not just the victims, the mothers. A lot of times women, the men homicides go up too because women start to understand that the only reason, the way they can make the abuse stop is to kill him. So we're not talking about just women dying, but men dying, and we don't want anyone to die. We want courts to start understanding that we need to make it easier for mothers to leave their abusers, not harder. And that's exactly what Kentucky is doing, along with
Absolutely.
others.
Now, both as a survivor and a professional, how do you support parents who feel silenced or disbelieved by the system?
Yeah, so it is a lot of empathy because I think mothers, and me included, went to family court thinking we were going to be validated, we were going to have justice, and it doesn't happen. In fact, it's the opposite. You get ridiculed, you're given less credibility, you are held to a higher standard of proof, and you are blamed for the actions of your abuser. And so instead of having the justice you think you're going to have and be able and having the people who are supposed to protect your children, you realize that you're all alone in that system. And so just being a coach, being part of Barry's team and expert, one of the things that keep me going every day, hearing story after story, is when I hear mothers tell us that after speaking with us, they now have some hope. And that is the best thing we can ask for. Because, of course, we can't control any outcomes of the case, but we can certainly provide that hope that we understand what's going on. We can tell you your story before you tell it to us. We can finish your sentences usually when you're talking about your case. Because it's not that this is something unique. It is the same tactics over and over again in this different state, same tactic, different court, same tactics. These attorneys that take your money and they don't understand domestic violence and they make your case worse than it was when you started, and you've spent your life savings on these attorneys who are making things worse rather than better. It's extremely frustrating. And so we want to come in early on in a case as we possibly can to help guide the attorneys, to help guide the mothers, because I can talk all day long about cases as a third party in an objective way. But when it's my own children and my own case, I need someone to talk to about it and know that they get it, right? Because most people don't. And even your best friend is not going to get it because they don't have that same experience.
Lived
They don't have
experience.
that.
Yep.
Yeah. And even when I hadn't gone through it myself, I didn't get it either. It wasn't.
Nobody knows.
I wanted to say that part of our testimony is supporting the mother. We want to let the judge know there's good reason to believe her. And we'll constantly talk about the fact that mothers make deliberate false reports less than 2% of the time, because the alienation theories have spread lies that mothers frequently make false reports, so that court professionals treat anything the mother says with great skepticism. And that's a mistake.
How do you know when something is real and when something is maybe exaggerated?
Well, you look at the big picture. When someone hires us, the first thing we do is we create the pattern of abuse, which is not a list of incidents, but of tactics that the alleged abuser made during the relationship and since. And so very often there's a lot of information that's helpful. One of the things that courts never think about doing is to look at the father's motives. Here's a man who, during the relationship, had little to do with caring for the child, suddenly demanding custody. What is his motive? Courts just want to assume he's acting out of love for the child. But when we look at the pattern, we see a lot of things he's doing where he's hurting the child in order to regain control and to punish the mother for leaving. If he's hurting the child, then he's not acting out of love for the child. So just as an example, courts are used to adjudicating financial issues, and so they just let the parents fight about it. But the point we want to make is, when the father doesn't pay child support or takes all the mother's money, that's taking resources that otherwise could have benefited the child, that he claims to love. If he's doing alienating things, which they often do, that's that. If he's denying or interfering with the child getting therapy that the child needs, he's again hurting the child. So we look at the tactics. Usually the father is revealing more than he intended. I taught in a battle program for 21 years. So from that, what I like to do is reframe what the abusive fathers are saying. And usually they're making a lot of admissions that they didn't intend. And a big part of it is when they're saying, I did nothing wrong, it's all the mother's fault. What they're really saying is, I haven't changed. We still need to change. And that is a giveaway, and courts don't know to even look for that.
So what would you have said in my case? Would you have seen that pattern? Would you have seen those red flags from the behaviors?
That's how standard practice is. But Allie, I must tell you that when we testify and we talk about that thing where a judge says, just because he hurts the mother doesn't mean he would hurt the child, and then we say, we know a lot of children lying in graves now because that's what the judge said. That's a really powerful thing.
It sure is. Yeah. I'll never understand it, to be honest. If someone was hurting anyone, even if it's a dog, that's enough grounds to step in and take a look at the bigger picture.
You know what's unbelievable? There was a research study in one of my books by Dr. Diane Bartlow, and what she did was follow up on child murders like yours, and she interviewed judges and court administrators in the communities where it occurred. And the question she was focused on is, what did you do in response to the tragedy in your community to better protect children?
Nothing.
And the shocking answer was nothing. They all thought that was an exception.
Exactly. Yep.
They all run to justify their mistakes.
Right.
And
like, how could we have known? How could we have known that would happen?
We were telling you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. I went to the courthouse the day before Grayson was killed, and I said, I fear for my child's life. And it didn't come out of nowhere. Who does that? That's not a normal behavior, to go down and go to a courthouse and say that to a judge. And
yeah, that's our point, is, do they think that this is fun for us? Like, they think we're just going to go in court and lie about things because we have all this money to spend on attorneys and family court and all of this stuff. Like, it really makes no common sense when you stop and you really think about it. But they're so ingrained in their heads now in career.
I mean, Grayson's father wasn't even on the birth certificate. We weren't even together. So for them to even say, oh, she's just a bitter ex or this or that, there was no grounds for that in my case. So they should have listened. They should have. But
they just assume all of these cases are the same.
But there's definitely no blanket case for any of this when it comes to family. That's for sure. So now, advocacy work like yours is definitely emotionally draining. So what keeps both of you grounded and hopeful in this fight,
Okay, I'll go first, I guess.
even if it's a hobby.
What keeps me grounded and hopeful is when I see wins, when I get feedback from mothers who said, your testimony made all the difference, or you get it, you give me hope. In fact, I just had a conversation with a mother yesterday who lives in Nevada, who I've been working with since 2022. She is using the legislation that just passed in Nevada in July. It was more of part of Caden's law, where it was the reunification therapies and things like that, because they were doing that. Well, the judge still ruled against her.
Wow.
However, she called me because I sent her the link where I testified at the legislator for Nevada for this legislation, and she heard my voice in it. And she called me and she goes, I didn't even know you had testified. She said, but I have your report that you did for me back in 2022. I'm doing an appeal immediately because the judge did not follow this new law. And it's things like that where it comes full circle and you can see that you are making a difference, because sometimes you don't know.
Sure.
You do everything that you can and you don't see the fruits of your labor, and that's okay. But when you do sometimes get that feedback that what you did made a difference, that obviously keeps you going.
Absolutely. I feel that too, because even just doing this podcast or getting Grayson's Law passed, I really appreciate when parents reach out to me, even by email, and just say, just so you know, Grayson and Grayson's Law saved my child's life.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it better. I didn't want to be that guinea pig. I don't want my son to be that guinea pig, but at least I know something is on the right track.
Well, I can tell you, when we first met with you, I don't know if you remember, you reached out to us not long after Grayson was gone and we talked. From that day to this day, I think there's been a lot of good things that have happened and movement for other children that may not still be here if it wasn't for your efforts. I really do appreciate that.
I see that, but there's still a long road ahead. But that's why I talk about it. The more I talk about it, the more people see that this does happen. I was a regular person and this happened out of nowhere. So it does happen.
Yes.
So that's why I'm always wanting to share as much as possible. And maybe I will write that book. Maybe we can talk about that.
And I'm just commend you and I'm proud of you. And I think that it's amazing what you do, because there can be two different responses to that. It's like, just go hide under a rock for the rest of your life, or it's try to do something. And that
I always say that if I chose that option of hiding in a rock or not getting out of bed, then the abuser wins. Grayson's father wins and will take power from the grave. And I refuse to give any more power back.
Right. Because it was all to hurt you. This was all done because of that.
All of it.
And of course his issues, but we don't want him to win, or any of those other ones, to any abusers to win, because that's all they care about.
Right. Because that's what he wanted. He wanted basically me to suffer. So where can listeners find your book and learn more about your ongoing work and your training opportunities, all that good stuff?
It's not out yet, probably in the next few months. It will be available on our publisher's website, which is Civic Research Institute. I'm sure when it comes out, we'll be doing a lot of things to tell people about the book. We're really excited about the book, and we're hoping to do a second book. The book we're doing in Civic Research Institute, they do books by and for professionals. The kind of books that you have all sorts of citations and several hundred pages, etc. We hope to do a second book that will be for the general public, because I don't know what this book is going to be in terms of cost, but it could easily be $150, $200. It's that type of book. We would do a book for the general public that would be a more normal priced book that will be more accessible. And also, hopefully, we could do some, what we call it, publicity to help the public know some of the things we talked about here, and also the fact that the United States is spending $3.6 trillion to allow men to abuse women, which would provide an incentive for public officials to change things.
Yeah, you would think.
We had some meetings before the last, not this election, but the one before that, because when we were investigating cancer and heart disease, what we found out was that in June of 1961, Cancer Society sent a letter to President Kennedy asking him to look at the research and to set up a committee. That's where we got the Surgeon General's report, and that's where everything happened because of that. And we were imagining the coming together, the Cancer Society and the Heart Association and DV organizations, and sending a letter to a president who was against domestic violence, against mistreating women, and maybe getting the national changes that are needed. And maybe when our second book comes out, we'll be ready to do that. But that might be it. And the financial benefits of preventing domestic violence could be a huge incentive.
Yeah, you got to talk their language, right? Money, sadly. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate you speaking with us and sharing all of your amazing work and for continuing to fight for the truth and research and all for the protection of child's rights to safety. So your work reminds us that domestic violence isn't just a family issue, it's a public health crisis and one that affects every part of our society. So the solution starts with awareness, courage, and action, and that's both what you do. So I thank you for that. And I will put all of your contact details in the show notes.
BarryGoldstein.net is our website. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much. And I will be in touch because there's a lot more that we can continue this conversation about. That's for sure.
Thank you, Allie.
We appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate that feedback. All right. Till next time.
All right. Nice to talk with you.
Bye.
If there's someone that you want to hear from on this podcast, please feel free to send me an email. Or if you would like to be a guest, please reach out at Allie@graysonschoice.org.